All right. So hi everyone. It was great that you could all join us on this session to understand the climate budgeting process that has been undertaken by New York and Mumbai both. It's the first year of actually implementing this budget for both cities. So it'll be really interesting to get to know a status check on where we're at and what the next steps are moving ahead with the climate budgeting process. So a quick introduction to the India for Nature-Based Solutions. We're a coalition of research, practice, and finance organizations that are working to scale up the adoption of nature-based solutions to shape climate resilient cities and communities in India. The forum itself was launched in 2022 at the World Urban Forum in Poland. Our steering committee and institutional partners currently comprise of 9 organizations, and we're in the process of growing actively as we move ahead with the 3 pillars of work that we're focusing on. The larger vision of the forum is to really adhere to the statement where we're looking to climate-proof 100 million residents and infrastructure worth 100 billion in Indian cities by 2030. And to achieve this vision, we have 3 objectives that we're focusing on. One is to define a shared language for urban nature-based solutions that is able to communicate the impact of nature-based solutions and also compels collaborative actions towards achieving this vision. The second is to really leverage capacities across different stakeholder groups to drive investments and to strengthen delivery mechanisms of solutions that are planned as well. And the third is to enable national and subnational policy that integrates and mainstreams nature-based solutions across municipal plans and projects. There are 3 pillars to the forum. One focuses primarily on funding and finance. The second focuses on knowledge and capacity building. And the third focuses more on coalition building. And there's a larger research program that we run through the forum as well. Session focuses on looking at how municipal budgets can be leveraged to mainstream, deliver, and scale nature-based solutions for adaptation and resilience, building urban resilience for communities at large. And for this, there'll be an exchange between New York and Mumbai in terms of the climate budgeting processes that they have each followed and in each city. We're going to be looking at this through 4 topics, essentially. One is the process and the strategies that were followed to integrate climate budgeting within municipal plans and frameworks. The second would be to look at key takeaways and outcomes from the first year of the climate budgeting analysis in both cities. The third would be to look at how we can leverage climate budgets to really enhance and address heat and flood resilience within cities. And the fourth will be looking at what kind of partnerships are required and what kind of stakeholder capacity building is required to really operationalize budgets. And today we have with us Peter Mattingly, who leads the Resilience Policy Unit at the NYC Mayor's Office of Management and Budget, driving climate integration into the city's budgeting process. Peter has a background in housing finance, structured data analysis, and urban policy, and has held analytical and managerial roles across the public and private sectors. We also have with Peter Mallory Rutigliano, who works on climate resiliency for the NYC Mayor's Office of Management and Budget as well, contributing primarily to the city's climate budgeting initiative. Mallory has previously conducted sustainable finance research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance and has a background in behavioral health research and environmental and biological sciences with an emphasis on policy. To present the work that has been undertaken in Mumbai, we have Avni Agarwal with us, who works as a program manager with WRI-India's urban development team. She has been supporting governance interventions to mainstream climate action in Mumbai. More recently, she's been working towards institutionalizing a dedicated department and cell to work primarily on climate, developing Mumbai's first climate budget, and accelerating climate action across Maharashtra's 43 cities. So we'll directly jump onto the presentations. Over to you, Peter. Just in terms of setting some house rules for a minute, the Q&A option is on. So we request all participants to keep parking your questions while the presentations are also being conducted. And we'll be addressing the questions at the very end. So we'll first have the presentation by Peter and Mallory, followed by the presentation by Avni. And we'll be taking up Q&A. There's enough time that's been set aside for a dedicated session to this as well. So do keep parking your questions within the Q&A box. Over to you, Peter.
Great, thank you. Let me get everything set up. Perfect. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. Today, Mallory and I are very excited to share New York City's approach to climate budgeting for resiliency in New York City. This framework integrates climate considerations into the heart of our decision-making and resource allocation to help ensure that our city remains sustainable and resilient in the face of future challenges. So to provide a quick overview of what we'll cover today, we'll start with an introduction to climate budgeting, dive into its processes and methodologies, explore how we align projects with climate goals, and conclude with our forward-looking efforts, including indicators and forecasting. To set the groundwork for today, climate budgeting in how we operate, it's more than just a financial exercise, it's a governance system that integrates climate considerations into our budget decision-making process. So it helps ensure that our spending aligns with our net zero and our resiliency goals, and it identifies gaps in our climate efforts and highlights where additional actions are needed. So it's important to note that climate budgeting is not necessarily about increasing funding. It's more about smarter, targeted investments that try to balance climate goals with other critical needs. To break down this process a little bit more in terms of our focus, so our work is led by the Office of Management Budget in partnership with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. To make this approach as comprehensive as possible, we do collaborate with agencies, other cities like Mumbai, and experts to support our ambitious goals, like achieving net zero emissions by 2050 and increasing resilience to flood and extreme heat. And of course, a key focus of ours is advancing environmental justice to ensure equitable outcomes for all communities across our city. In terms of the actual process, so let me walk you through what our climate budgeting process looks like. It consists of 5 steps. So assess, communicate, develop, evaluate, and implement. So this cycle allows us to measure progress toward our goals, engage, communicate with agencies and stakeholders, develop climate-friendly initiatives, evaluate proposed actions and investments, and of course, implement those actions and investments. So by iteratively refining this process, we ensure that investments remain effective and that they're aligned with our climate goals. One of our largest, most recent milestones, most recently this year, was the release of our climate budgeting publication. So in April 2024, we released our first climate budgeting publication. This document outlines our analytical framework for evaluating emissions, aligning projects with climate objectives, optimizing co-benefits. It's a living document that will evolve over time to reflect improvements in data and methodology. And next April, we'll have more of a showcase to talk about our advancements in resiliency. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mallory.
Thank you so much, Peter. So to set the scene a little bit for some of the research that I'll describe that came out in our most recent climate budgeting report in April of this year, I'll make a little bit of an analogy. So for us, climate budgeting is a bit like setting the route on a trip that you're taking. You don't necessarily need to pave the road yourself. You don't need to make a new GPS app, but you need to use the tools that are available and put them together in order to understand sort of where you're starting, where you're going, and when you want to get there. So one of the ways that we're doing this is through what we're calling our capital plan climate alignment assessment. This is a way for us to evaluate projects in our capital plan to understand sort of what they bring us in terms of those benefits toward net zero emissions and also increased resiliency to heat and flooding. We want to know before we get to our destination if we're on the right track, how quickly we're going, if we're taking a shortcut. So this is one of the initiatives we'll describe that we've been doing analytically in order to understand those dynamics. So one of the first thing that we've done is basically gone through the thousands of projects in the city's capital commitment plan, which is a list of this large projects that'll occur up to 10 years in the future. We developed a methodology that can be applied across a diverse set of projects so that we can rate them and compare them to one another on whether or not the project aligns or advances with our climate commitments. So the first rating that we have sort of is dark green. This means that it is fully aligned with our long-term climate goals, that net zero emissions and those increasing resiliency and heat benefits. Next slide, please. Then we also have a rating for light green, or an aligned component. This is basically for projects that have a climate-friendly element embedded within the larger project, but it is not necessarily for the overall intent or complete purpose of the project to be aligning with those climate goals. The next is our yellow category, or short-term benefits. These are projects that might bring gains toward climate goals in the near term, but not in the long term. So for example, that could be something like increasing efficiency of fuel equipment by switching from oil to natural gas. It's not aligned with our long-term climate goals, but it might bring short-term gains in terms of efficiency. So we don't consider that to be aligned fully. And then we have our red category, or not aligned. Those are projects that do not help us reach our goals in the short or long term. So while our team is looking at every project, there are some that don't have enough information in order to do this rating at the time they sort of come to our office that we can't apply a color to. So we're working actively over our next climate budgeting cycle to fill these gaps. Next, please. So as you can see here, this is an example of our rating system for the capital plan for our net zero goal. We have separately rated for net zero, heat resiliency benefits, and flood resiliency benefits. And these pie charts represent the proportion of projects that could be rated that were rated according to these colors that I mentioned. So you see for net zero, we have slices that are all the colors, but only 24% or a quarter of the capital plan could be rated. And so we're trying to work with agencies to find more information and fill those gaps. On the side of flooding and heat resiliency, fewer projects, less of the proportion of total projects in the plan were able to be rated. You can see for heat, only 14%. And you'll notice there's an absence of those yellow and red slices of the pies. This is because we found it's actually easier for us to identify where projects are bringing us resiliency benefits than to identify where there might be missed opportunities or projects that are sort of not following those goals. So we're working really actively in the current cycle and in the future of our climate budgeting work to try to fill these informational gaps and figure out sort of what might these yellow and reds look like in resiliency. Okay, next, please. So in addition to assessing the projects that are in our plan, we are also developing an exercise to sort of map the route as we go, kind of coming back to that route setting analogy from earlier. So we might use a tool in that example as like something as like a map or GPS to help us predict if we'll get to our destination on time. So we're trying to do that exact same thing or concept for our climate budgeting work, because this will influence how we make decisions on the road, depending on whether or not our route is changing, how quickly we think we'll get there, and if we'll be on time. So this is a chart here showing the city's greenhouse gas baseline in gray. That's that sort of squiggly line showing our historic levels of emissions. This is something that has been established for the city for some time, but we have undertaken over the past year, and as published in our most recent climate budgeting report, a new analysis that shows us what we think our trajectories or different kinds of scenarios might be given the actions that the city, the state, and the US government are taking in order to reduce our emissions. So basically what we did was we partnered with the US Environmental Protection Agency to model scenarios based on layered emissions impacts. So you can see here on the right of the chart, there are labels, market trends and federal policy, planned large-scale renewables, city actions. These are the different types of activities that are planned or under law that we think will help us reduce our emissions if they go according to their plans or with some sort of behavioral element. On the bottom right of this chart, you can see that there's in yellow our net zero emissions goal. So essentially what we've been doing is adding up the different types of actions that can help us reduce our emissions, quantifying what those reductions would be, and then comparing that over time to our overall goals. You'll notice also at 2030 and 2040, there are sort of interim targets with little yellow dots. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we can accomplish through this is not just seeing ahead of time where we might go depending on the actions we think we will take, but also to help us route set and, like I said, sort of make sure that we're on the right track and course correct if we're not. So one example here is that through our analysis, the green line here is just showing that added trajectory from the previous chart that was sort of added up from those different lines. Our 2030 goal is actually something we're on track to reach. The city and state actions that we believe we'll be taking will lead us to reach our 2030 interim emissions reduction target. But we can also then see that we are not yet poised based on the actions we think we'll be taking to reach our emissions reduction goal toward fully net zero by 2050. So this tells us that in the short term, we're actually doing a great deal and we should keep going in that route, but that in the longer term, we will actually have to do more in order to meet those additional goals for reductions past 2030. So this can really help us understand the impact of what we're doing and where we need to do more. And then we're not just trying to take this to sort of a high-level trajectory. We're also trying to translate it into impacts for New Yorkers on the ground. So this is through our work in partnership with the New York City Health Department on the health benefits associated with those emissions reduction that I've just described. So we've modeled the potential avoided premature deaths, avoided in emergency room visits, and hospitalizations for asthma that are associated with the pollution that comes along with those emissions and what the constituent reductions would be. So we estimate that we'll have, for example, 2,400 avoided premature deaths on if we reach our New York City trajectory that we expect, and then an additional 1,600 reduced or avoided premature deaths if we were to actually get all that way to net zero. So what we've done is said, okay, according to our trajectory now, here's what we think the health benefits will be. And then if we actually meet our target, here's the additional benefits, which can help us to benchmark and see how we're doing and also how we're affecting the lives of people in our communities. Okay, so next I'll mention some upcoming work concepts. We've talked about where we've been and what was published in the last report, our analyses. Now we're going to talk about where we're going. And this pertains to basically the topic of our discussion today on resiliency measures. The main threats that we are calculating for right now are extreme heat and flooding. We have threats from rainfall-based flooding and coastal flooding. And we're trying to understand what the strategy is for reducing these and how to do a similar sort of mapping or course exercise like we've been doing with our routes for emissions. So one part of the strategy is assessing resiliency by using a suite of key performance indicators, what I might refer to as KPIs, basically metrics that serve as a proxy for our risk and inversely for levels of our resiliency. So many may be familiar with this sort of Venn diagram on the right, the risk trifecta. You have your hazard, which is actually the threats that we face, our vulnerability, which are the social components that make individuals more or less susceptible to harm, and then our exposure, which is basically the people and assets and spaces in the way of those hazards that may have different levels of vulnerability. So we're building off of great work that's already been done in the city to map our hazards and characterize our social vulnerability. And we've been focusing on our risk exposure to understand this more. So we've been working with our partners to explore resiliency KPIs and future progress in order to help track where we're going and make decision-making informed. So next slide, please. To determine which KPIs are useful for understanding our risk exposure across the city, we've conducted literature-based research, consulted with experts, and dug through quite a bit of data in order to select what these important KPIs are for measuring resiliency across the board. Because we don't have a single measure such as greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we need to pull together different measures of our resiliency that impact us. So some data is more useful than others as we were doing this selection process. So we've been selecting indicators that are first representative, meaning that they speak to overall city goals and plans, such as the city's Plan YC sustainability plan that came out last year. They need to be robust, meaning they are backed in science and experience and are useful for understanding our threats. We want to make sure they're based in science and technical expertise. And they need to be trackable, meaning they can be updated over time to see how the city changes commensurate with our growing threats. We can't use data sets as well that are, one-off. We need to make sure we can look longitudinally. Next, please. So here's an example of how we could break down indicators or these KPIs. Here on the left, I sort of break out the threats or hazards into groupings for extreme heat and flooding, and then into 4 sort of sub-threats of outdoor heat, indoor heat, coastal flooding, and inland or rainfall-based flooding. And then you can see on the right examples of what indicator groupings might look like. For example, these are design strategies that influence those hazards and endeavor to see how they shape our exposure across neighborhoods. So that could be something like tree canopy cover, which provides shade and cooling benefits. I think that's probably well understood in this audience focused on NbS. But we're also looking at things such as, flood barriers or insurance or sewer infrastructure. Those elements that added together give us adaptive capacity against our threats. And then we can sort of pull these together to understand our larger trajectories. Next, please. So here's just an example to make this a little more concrete of an indicator, and a focus here on outdoor heat as an example, with tree canopy cover being one of the indicators in order to understand that to be our design strategy to managing outdoor heat, amongst other things. So we can use this well because we have a clear data source. The city collects aerial imagery through remote sensing methods and updates it at a 5-year interval, so we can understand over time how this indicator is changing. We also know that this is relevant for resiliency because of the shade it provides and the evapotranspiration of the trees. So we know that the literature well established is that urban trees cool city spaces and also provide additional co-benefits. Also, we can sort of map where we're going in the future because the city has a target to achieve 30% tree canopy cover in the future compared to our current levels. And we know our status of 22% because of work done by the New York City Parks Department in order to understand where those trees are and characterize them. And they will have climate budgeting implications by using this KPI. So project proposals that impact the density or of trees or canopy can be seen and measured up to what our entire goal will be. So this is an example of a way that we might use a KPI to understand our overall exposure to our threats of extreme heat and flooding, and then add different KPIs together in order to create a trajectory not dissimilar from what we see in the emission side in order to help track our progress, route where we want to go, and make sure that we're arriving at our destination on time. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Peter and Mallory. I think that was really interesting to see, particularly the section on the forecast to achieve cities' climate goals and commitments, and how the climate budgeting exercise really plays a role in achieving those goals. I have a couple of questions around that as well. Would be really interesting to discuss this further, but we'll do that after Avni's presentation. Just before that, for the audience, do park your questions within the Q&A box, and we'll be addressing all of the questions after Avni's presentation. Over to you, Avni.
Hi, I'm just sharing my screen. Just give me a minute. Is my screen visible? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'm Avni, and as Shruti mentioned, that I work with WRI, and we have been working with the city corporation, the WRI Mumbai Municipal Corporation, and with C40 cities on Mumbai's climate budget process for the past 3 years since we started our climate action planning process. And earlier this year, the city unveiled its first climate budget report on World Environment Day, and yes, became the 4th city to do so, along with Oslo, London, New York. Just to take the audience through the process that we followed in Mumbai, step one for us, because this climate budgeting also started, we kind of parallelly worked on our climate action plan and the climate budgeting process. Our first step was really developing a city level climate action plan. So the Mumbai climate action plan was our starting point. Post that, we set up a team. The team had representatives from the Environment and Climate Change Department. There was a small climate budget team that was put together. The city corporation hired certain consultants. There were representatives from the finance department at the corporation. And we began understanding the municipal funding, the existing municipal funding and the existing budget through a climate lens. So we did that for 3 consecutive years. And that allowed us to figure out how we could integrate climate into the city corporation's existing budgeting process. And using that, we prepared a climate budget template, integrated it into the city's budget circular, and yes, began kickstarted the climate budgeting process last year. And essentially, what the climate budgeting process entailed is us sharing the city's climate objectives with 20 different departments within the corporation, reviewing budget proposals of departments from a climate lens, and then doing a climate impact assessment of the projects that were part of the climate budget proposals. And then we're currently in the monitoring and reporting stage, and we're also trying to expand the scope of the climate budget to include more agencies. But we've also already moved to step 4, because, yeah, this is an iterative process and will happen every year. So Mumbai's climate budgeting process is entirely premised on and based on our climate action planning process. And the climate action planning process is again based on a very detailed climate baseline assessment. And through the baseline assessment, we identified key risks for the city. These include urban heat, flooding, landslides, air pollution, and coastal risks. And based on, of course, the GHG inventory as well, and a future emission scenario model mapping and the consultations we had, we squared in on 6 key action tracks for the city to work towards, or 6 key priority sectors and 24 action tracks to work towards. So we had 3 mitigation focused action tracks and 3 adaptation and resilience focused action tracks. Our adaptation and resilience focused action tracks were range from urban greening and biodiversity, urban flooding and water resource management, and air quality. While we were developing these action tracks, I mean, even though the mitigation focused action tracks were about reducing emissions, there were certain activities that, for example, encouraging passive design strategies to improve thermal comfort, that did correlate with the adaptation and resilience focused action tracks. So based on these 24 action tracks, we asked city departments to align their budget proposals, or each of their budget activities, with one of the climate action tracks, and provide implementation details for us to do climate impact assessment. And this is again essentially the way we've tried to capture ANR activities in Mumbai's climate budget report. So, on the left side, you'll see we didn't do a detailed like a quantified analysis. but we did do a basic co-benefits mapping. So, for example, in the hydraulic engineers department, you can see there are activities related to repairing water loss and leakages and water contamination in the city. In the sewerage operations department, there are activities related to using bioremediation technology to rehabilitate lagoons. In the sewerage projects department, there are actions related to rejuvenating the city's river ecosystems, and we've done a basic mapping with co-benefits, SDG co-benefits. So, for example, rejuvenation of the rivers has been aligned to reducing pollution and restoring aquatic ecosystems in the city, and co-benefits and have been mapped to SDG co-benefits on avoiding waterborne diseases and improving health outcomes in the city. And along with this, while we couldn't do a quantitative analysis, we've included implementation details, locations, and quantity in the annexures of the report. So that's how we've covered adaptation and resilience activities in our current climate budget. And 1/3 of BMC's capital budget is aligned with the climate action plan. And from that 1/3, 59% is focused on mitigation related activities, 19% is focused on adaptation related activities, and 22% of the budget is focused on resilience focused activities that kind of include improvement of essential services and disaster preparedness in the city. I wanted to actually focus on this section, which is about how we are now in our upcoming budget cycle trying to update our processes and integrate adaptation and resilience and nature-based solutions more proactively. And there are three ways in which we're trying to do this. One is through climate literacy workshops and meetings to socialize and to communicate the city's climate hazard and vulnerability assessment to the city departments, to ward officers, to external agencies. The second is we're trying to integrate adaptation and resilience indicators to highlight the impact in the upcoming climate budget report. So just like we have a standardized process to understand emission impact for mitigation focused activities, we're trying to incrementally standardize our climate impact assessment for adaptation and resilience activities for our upcoming climate budget. And the third is we're trying to conceptualize adaptation and resilience projects with the Environment and Climate Change Department, which is a newly established independent department within the city corporation, and using that as a basis to promote more innovative nature-based solutions and adaptation and resilience solutions across other departments within the municipal corporation. So in the climate literacy workshops, we've covered we cover detailed climate risk assessment. I wanted to show some examples. So we're trying to communicate with the officers working on specific departments and working in specific geographies and jurisdictions, what their areas vulnerability is with respect to different climate stresses. So, for example, this is for Zone 5. Mumbai has 7 zones, and we take officers through vulnerabilities of every zone and letting them know what potential activities they could take up either at the ward level or at the departmental level. So, for example, here we can clearly see one of the wards, the M East ward, has the highest percentage of population that is affected by heat. Similarly, we're trying to show to the departments what the correlation between vegetation cover and heat is. Again, here landslide prone locations, it tells you, which ward is the most vulnerable and has the highest percentage of population that is exposed to landslide risks. Similarly, with flood risk exposure. And along with the climate risk assessment, we also get into details of the vulnerability assessment of the city, which is connected with access to basic infrastructure services. And often absence of these services makes communities much more vulnerable or differentially vulnerable to these climate risks. So again, as you can see, the M East ward is the most vulnerable here in terms of access to services like sanitation, electricity, transit stations, and open green spaces. Um, so the second way in which we're trying to integrate adaptation into our upcoming process is um, devising indicators or using indicators from the city's climate action plan to standardize or to create a framework to report on adaptation actions. So this is again an example of the urban greening and biodiversity sector, wherein we have 4 action tracks on increasing vegetation cover on permeable surfaces, reducing urban heat island effect, promoting equitable access to green open spaces, and restoring and enhancing biodiversity in the city. And corresponding to each action track, the climate action plan identifies several monitoring indicators for actions, and it also identifies key performance indicators for the monitoring and reporting of the plan on an annual basis. And using those, we're trying to identify indicators that departments could potentially give us information on, or that we could potentially get source information from other agencies or through secondary sources on. So, for example, in the first indicator is on number of trees planted, total area restored. The second indicator, which is on reducing urban heat island effect, looks at indicators like mean land surface temperature at the ward level, what are the number of heat prone wards. Um, the third indicator looks at population having access to a green open space within 500-meter radius. And the last indicator is about the city's biodiversity index. And these are all fairly simple indicators. That's been our screening process, that we choose indicators that we know, of course, that are representative of the action track, but also that the city is able to report on an annual basis or for their specific projects. And the third way that we're trying to integrate adaptation and resilience is through innovative projects along with the Environment and Climate Change Department. So, as I mentioned, the city has recently established a dedicated department. They did have a smaller version of this department in the past few years, but now this is an independent, dedicated department that can also have its own budget. And has 50 new positions, so we'll have the capacity to think about innovative solutions and to coordinate across different departments within the city corporation. So this is again just an example of a project which is the Climate Resilient Streets project, where we've been thinking about, if we look at street infrastructure, how can we integrate certain softer NbS solutions, either in junction design work or along footpaths and road networks. And while I think the biggest, when we discuss some of these solutions with departments, the feedback we often receive is what is the success rate of these solutions, or what is the impact of these solutions, what is the scalability of these solutions. And with the Environment and Climate Change Department, we're trying to explore how they can be implemented, and then use those learnings to disseminate across different departments, and through the climate budgeting process, nudge departments to use these softer solutions as well in their everyday work. Similarly, the city corporation does a lot of work on flood management already. They're building holding tanks, retaining walls, they're setting up pumping stations. But through the climate budgeting process, we're also trying to nudge city departments towards more hybrid NbS solutions. Um, Again, this is an example of a project which integrates nature-based solutions along with socio-economic benefits, and is an implementation solution in an underserved community. So again, this is an example for the department and for the corporation to understand if an adaptation and resilience project had to be implemented at the community level in an underserved community, what would be how would they go about it, and what would be the indicators, the procurement processes, etc. And using learnings from these innovative projects, we are trying to integrate them into departmental objectives and make tangible certain asks on NbS, on ANR, so that departments can, one, integrate some of these ideas into their existing projects. So, for example, the bridges department looks at foot-over bridges, looks at crossings in the city, and can they look at their pre-existing work from a lens? Can they apply an additional sort of layer, or can they think of newer projects? Can they think of newer projects from a climate lens? I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Avni. It was great to see how the climate budgeting process has led to the identification of certain actions which can be undertaken on ground already in the form of the first practice projects that you just showed us. Hi, Peter. Hi, Mallory. We have a range of questions in the chat already. I'm going to get started with a question to both of you first. How did you address data gaps that were really encountered to develop baselines and improve the understanding of future climate risks in order to prioritize and incentivize solutions? If you could just shed light on how you encountered those challenges during the climate budgeting process. Peter and Mallory, over to you first.
I'm happy to let Mallory take this, as she's been in the weeds with a lot of the data work. But I'll say it's quite laborious and required extensive collaboration to even be able to identify those gaps. I'll turn it over to Mallory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Peter, it is very laborious for sure. And the different work streams that we described sort of have different processes. So, the data gaps related to those pie charts that I showed right before those sort of trajectory graphs with our climate alignment assessment, that, yellow, red, green. Those data gaps sort of emerge naturally by looking through project descriptions and documents, because information, is submitted and we do understand the scope of projects, but there's always a trade-off between understanding a project very early in its conception and understanding a project very thoroughly. So that's a big data gap. The earlier on that you sort of want to evaluate a project, the less information is available because it's just not as developed. It perhaps isn't cited. It might not have gone through, scoping or design. It's certainly not in construction. And so we are constantly balancing that trade-off when we're looking at projects that are newer, of saying, okay, how much information can we reasonably get in order to do a sufficient evaluation, and how much of it truly isn't known yet, and it wouldn't be reasonable to know it because, you can't propose a project and know exactly where it's going to be before you scope it. That would be irresponsible. So some of the data gaps will always remain. We will wait until we get more project information in order to fill those gaps, and that will come naturally through the course of projects. But by doing this process, we are encouraging more information when it is available, and we're also encouraging more advanced consideration of resiliency for projects that may not be thinking of it from the get-go. And that can help us fill those gaps. As we sort of, I guess, normalize or socialize this ideology of considering resiliency early in projects, it'll make it easier to do so and disclose to us when it could be available. On the other work streams, like the trajectory, that the forecasting exercise takes a lot of decision making. So we'll never be able to include, for example, all KPIs or all city actions in the trajectory as it stands right now, because there are a lot of things that either by intention or just through ancillary effects will increase or decrease our resiliency or our emissions. So what we've been focusing on is basically selecting the largest parts of what that constitutes. And I kind of mentioned the research process and the diagrams that I showed earlier. Those are really important for us doing that. We've done so much literature review and research and speaking with experts, both within city government and outside, external academic experts and practitioners, in order to understand what those biggest, most predictive types of projects or work or initiative or mandates are, so that we can really focus on doing the analysis around those, even though we know there might be many other things that are part of the puzzle, that are pieces. Eventually, we'll hope to get as many of them as we can, but right now we're focusing our time on what we think will have the biggest impact. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So before just getting to Avni, there was a follow-up question in chat in relation to this, around the risk exposure assessment that you mentioned. So through the risk exposure assessment, were you able to prioritize certain projects, and was then a higher share of funding allotted to these priority areas that experience increased climate risk? So if you could just shed some more light on the risk exposure assessment as well.
Sure, of course. I'll look to one project in particular. So last year we had a much broader general lens. This year we had a much more narrower, tailored focus to be able to evaluate projects, having learned from last year's review of capital new needs. And one project in particular that stood out, while we are continuing to develop a baseline foundation, we were really intrigued by a project that would allow us to do that. And one project that stood out, it's called Atlas. It's a type of software that helps to model the city's sewer system to be able to capture what we hope flooding, movements of water during extreme weather events as well. That would help allow us to sort of determine areas that had key vulnerabilities, so that we could, in later stages, prioritize those areas for greater resiliency. So that was one project where we were able to determine a baseline was needed to better understand our system, our infrastructure as a city, and be able to help build a foundation that would allow us in future cycles where we could apply critical infrastructure or the necessary infrastructure to address those key vulnerabilities. That's one project that really stood out. I think also Cloudburst as well. Maybe Mallory can speak to that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of work underway related to nature-based solutions, or like green infrastructure or green and gray infrastructure. And examples of those include things like Peter just mentioned, our Cloudburst projects, which are integrated projects at neighborhoods that experience high levels of flooding, particularly rainfall-based flooding, where the city's taking a very systematic approach to understanding how to manage those risks. So rather than sort of handling them with one-off projects, they're taking a very systematic evaluation and in many ways reconstruction of the neighborhood's water infrastructure. That includes NbS and gray infrastructure in order to reduce their risk. And that's a type of work that is really collaborative for us, because the Cloudburst projects are being proposed in several different neighborhoods across the boroughs of New York City. And they are a way for us to understand where the most risk is. But there's always prioritization, because there are more places that are experiencing high risk than can be handled next year or the year after that. They have to be staggered. So the city agencies, not just OMB, is undertaking a lot of work to prioritize projects and understand where the risk is most pressing, and then roll those out in terms of how they will actually get implemented and constructed over time and designed, including with the community. And then the last thing I'll just add is related to what we showed on the resiliency KPIs. That is still in development. We're still working on that for the upcoming publication with the city's next executive budget, which is expected probably right in April. And we will be doing more of this sort of iterative analysis and prioritization as that comes out. But it is a new work stream for us and is very pioneering for the city. So we will have more examples in the future because that's still in the works.
All right. Avni, if you wanted to just speak a bit on how you have addressed data gaps through the climate budget process, and also in terms of the frequency of collecting data to then inform priority actions that the budget can take, for example, in the next year to meet the city's climate objectives.
So yeah, obviously, I think that's been a big sort of challenge for us. And in our last budget, which was published this year, or in our last budget cycle, we really had to go to departments like 3 or 4 times. We had to do many follow-ups. And it was also not just about collecting data, but it was also explaining to departments how they could, explaining certain indicators, or asking them if they had proxies that could match those sort of data sets. So even for our emission analysis, for example, or even a lot of the ANR projects and the details that we mentioned, like that we've kind of included in descriptive forms, there was a lot of taking it down, especially in the Indian context. I think we know how some of this information is also passed on a bit informally. So we had a person who kind of was dedicated to collecting this information from departments, and did this over a period of like 3-4 months, and which also kind of delayed our climate budget publishing and the launch, because we had to, go through a long verification process. So I think we tried to do it through larger interdepartmental meetings. Over a period of time, we realized we needed to have more dedicated conversations, more one-on-one conversations with departments. And that, I think, really kind of helped us collect data or to do climate impact assessment over time. Yes.
All right, thank you. I think next there's a question on evaluation and monetization of co-benefits. This is addressed to Peter and Mallory. So one of the challenges that we really experience in India for funding nature-based solutions is being able to value and then monetize co-benefits. RPS posed this question, and then she says that you mentioned anticipated health co-benefits. And the question is whether there are any value capturing mechanisms that you anticipate coming out of climate budget projects which are being implemented. Peter and Mallory?
It's a great question. Maybe I'll turn to Mallory first, and then I'll give it a second.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we do a good deal of work on things like cost benefit analysis or cost effectiveness in the budget office. And other agencies, the city departments, do as well. There's a lot of work that's done when projects are being formulated to understand benefits. Our analysis of air quality related health benefits is mostly pertaining at this time to our emissions trajectories. But we are investigating how we can do that for the slightly more nascent resiliency work. We're sort of working on doing the first step of that work, and then hope to, also look at benefits. The other thing I'll say is we are partnering very meaningfully with the city's Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, which is the leader on a project called the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, or CRDG, that we have. It's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a set of guidelines for climate resiliency design that is mandated through a local law. It is not yet fully implemented. It will come into effect, I believe, fully in 2027, but it is in a pilot phase right now with several projects, something like 35 or 40 projects across city agencies, which basically entails screening projects at inception for their pertinent climate risks related to the asset, like if there's a new building proposed or a park, for example, and then making sure that either qualitative or quantitative, depending on the scope of the project, cost-benefit analysis is conducted, and then appropriate resiliency measures are selected for the project. So essentially what it is a set of guidelines so that city large projects across the board will have to make sure that they're managing their asset level risk and also incorporating best practice guidelines such as NbS into their project scopes while they're getting designed and constructed. Sort of, it's going to be top of mind. It's going to be from the beginning of the project, not an add-on later. So we have been partnering with the team at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice that is developing these climate resiliency design guidelines and making sure that it aligns with climate budgeting as sort of two very parallel work streams. And that work does entail the rollout of cost-benefit analysis features for different types of projects for resiliency specifically. So we're not reinventing the wheel on that, we're partnering, but this is something that the city's working on.
Right.
Oh,
yeah,
and
Peter, go ahead.
thanks. So sorry, it took me a second to fire up. I think in, the traditional space for resiliency, often the go-to methodology has been something called loss avoidance, where looking to, areas that have been impacted, particularly by extreme weather events, that to measure, in a sense, resiliency or to track progress is to determine if the same scenario were to happen again with reinforcement of infrastructure, resilience measures in place, what's the loss avoided? Typically, that's been measured, in monetary value. It's been very limited in the sense of what it actually can reveal, and obviously the introduction of something more holistic to capture those more like socioeconomic benefits as well, people's lives and everything that actually, create a much larger picture of, the potential for these projects. And so going beyond loss avoidance at a very minimal level of just property value, thinking too about, as Mallory was talking about, building out more, return on investments, cost benefit analysis that try to capture a more holistic picture. So working with one of our universities in the city currently with students basically helping us to get a better sense of capturing a lot of those more like non-monetary benefits of resiliency work and infrastructure across these different kinds of hazards. So it's still in progress, but I'll say that that also is something that's slowly evolving in the resiliency space.
Thanks for that. Just a quick follow-up question was that then can the climate budget exercise and the cost benefit analysis that you do already also be looked at as an instrument that can help mobilize private finance to address the funding gap, which you had highlighted during the forecast slide that you projected? So can this, for example, be used to facilitate early engagement between city government and private partners when designing climate projects? And has this been done yet?
Sure, I think public-private partnerships are absolutely key. And there have been many conversations, particularly in areas downtown that have focused on, how to finance certain projects for resiliency, especially in terms of flooding. And we do obviously get a lot of support from the federal government in terms of monetary value and grants. Thinking too more about collaboration, I think one of the statistics we have is that looking obviously to like trees that are on private properties as well and how they contribute to a canopy coverage and how to continue to facilitate that growth. Mallory, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just that we've actually already been seeing this kind of appetite for the private sector to be following guidelines like those we're developing for the city. Some of the laws and mandates that we have apply to both, such as our benchmark large buildings emissions reductions law, Local Law 97, which is built into our forecast. That covers public and private buildings that are large and are emitting and sort of require electrification or emissions reductions over time. So we have a lot of work that speaks directly to what the private sector must do to align and conform with city rules and goals, and also laws that are built into our forecast. So they can naturally look at those and sort of understand where they fit in, because we spell out very clearly which components are part of our forecast, and some of them and many of them include the private sector, like Peter was mentioning, for trees, but also for things like buildings emissions reductions. But then, we have a consortium in the city called the Climate Knowledge Exchange, which is a group of academics, nonprofits, some private organizations, and city government agencies that can come together to discuss and learn more about what one another is doing on climate resiliency and adaptation. And these meetings happen periodically, and we have presented on climate budgeting at one of them. And those who are in the private sector were asking us questions about how they can get on board, how they can start following this, how they can use the tools we're developing in the private sector, not just in the public sector. So there is an appetite for what we're developing to be used across the board, because people know that they're either going to have to just conform with laws or they're going to be trying to just do better in their work. And so, because we're going to be releasing this as part of the climate budgeting publication again, our work and our technical methodology is all public. And so anybody in the private sector who wants to use our methodology in order to replicate our work or understand their own trajectories can do so.
Thanks. That answers the question. And it was also really interesting to see that through your rating system, you do organize short-term, medium-term versus long-term benefits, which are achieved through the sort of climate resiliency projects, which can then, help mitigate some of the risks that private investors experience in terms of, getting wanting shorter term returns. But for nature-based solutions projects, for example, you do get returns in over a longer span of time. So it was interesting to see the methodology that's been applied there. Avni, so there's a question in the chat which asks, how does the implementation of ANR currently look like in Mumbai? And is it being implemented on an expected rate, or is it at a slower or a faster rate in relation to the targets which have been set through the climate action plan?
Okay. I also want to answer your earlier data question a little
Apologies,
more. Just
yes.
as Mallory and Peter were speaking, I kind of remembered. I wanted to mention that on the data front, I think the easiest indicators or the easiest information to at least start collecting is the quantity, the quality, and the location. So I guess anybody who's doing, or whichever cities that are trying this out, they could start from there. So I just wanted to highlight that they can start with, like, most departments or cities would know where their projects are located, or what is the quantum. If they don't know the quantum, they would know how they're going about implementation, or what technology they're going to adopt, etc. So yeah, I wanted to mention that on the previous question. On this question of, what is the status of ANR implementation in Mumbai? Well, it is a complicated question. There is a lot of work happening on the ANR front. In fact, the current climate budget pretty much the maximum proportion of alignment of funds is with the urban flooding and water resource management sector. And the city corporation is allocating a lot of resources and also research and R&D and data analysis on managing flooding in the city. And Mumbai has had a history of flooding, and we've seen some really big flood events in the past. And I guess because of that, the city's stormwater drainage department, for example, is extremely sophisticated. However, I think what we're currently grappling with and I think maybe on the greening front, there is a gardens department, and there is an independent department, and they do maintain parks in the city. But again, what is the quality of implementation, or what are the approaches of implementation? So one of the slides that I showed on flooding, for example, the city is currently using a fair bit of grey infrastructure to address the flooding problem in the city. So, whether it's building retaining walls, or, it's building holding tanks. While a lot of the flooding issues in the city have been, resolved in certain areas, the city is also concretizing quite rapidly, currently. So I think what we are trying to do is, so I mean, if I had to just say, what is happening on the ANR front, there's quite a bit happening. But I think what the city, or through the Environment and Climate Change Department, what they are trying to do is also move implementation to possibly integrate softer and more hybrid solutions. And I think that's where, a lot of R&D and resources and finance possibly will have to be devoted.
All right. There's another question on the distribution of funds for new projects, essentially. Where the question says that, and this is for Avni. So when you say that 1/3 of municipal budget is assigned to climate action, is that through redistribution of existing funds or through generation of new funds? If the latter, then what are the different financial streams that have been mobilized? I think this is also in relation to some of the first practice projects that you highlighted through the presentation.
So the climate budget cycle goes parallelly with the municipal budgeting cycle. So it's not as if the climate budgeting process is devoid from the municipal budgeting process. It's very much part of the pre-existing budgeting process. So it's not reallocation of funding. It's proactively encouraging or nudging departments to think about their work from a climate lens, and to encourage them to think about newer climate projects on an annual basis. It's not as if it's a new pool of money where it's the annual municipal sort of finance that is distributed. And on your second part of your question, which is on the first practice projects, again, these first practice projects have been under development. Couple of them have been implemented. This year, there will be dedicated allocation to these first practice projects. Last year, a lot of the implementation of the NbS projects happened through pre-existing departmental budgets. So, for example, there was an urban forest project in one of the localities. The funds for that came from the planning department of the BMC. And again, I think there was possibly soil requirement for that project, which came from the gardens department. This year, through the Environment and Climate Change Department, because it is also an independent department, they can have their own independent budget. So they will possibly allocate and earmark funding for projects on aquifer mapping and possibly the greening in vulnerable neighborhoods project, and the urban forest project. Yeah.
All right, thank you. There's a question from the BBMP, and that is first for Mallory and Peter. Well, the question asks, how long did the climate budgeting exercise take in New York from start till date? And the second part of that question is more. This is the Bangalore municipality that's asking the question as well. So they're curious to know if you had any insights from the budget for other cities, essentially to know a little bit more about what kind of interest you're seeing with other cities in the US, whether this as a process can be standardized to different geographies as well, and what is the potential to really scale this to even medium and smaller scale municipalities.
Sure. I think kicking it off, so our task force was established in 2021 with the approval of the budget director. It's taken several years to refine and work out the process for our climate alignment assessment, and that is still evolving too. Especially in terms of better capturing the methodology for resiliency. Thinking more to your other question about looking for similar geographies, we I think strive to learn as much from other cities as well, not to reinvent the wheel or to better understand most similarly best practices and so forth. Of course, I think we've learned that almost every city is very unique in terms of funding strategies, prioritization, hazards and exposures. I think working through C40 especially has been a great exercise for us to see how adaptation looks and how it's best incorporated. Through our methodology, being able to determine how applicable some projects might be or relevant in terms of capturing for heat or flooding. And while that's still evolving, I would say that we try to look for maybe more foundational concepts of how to capture applicability for resiliency. Turn to Mallory if she has thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, and just to add to the timeline, we're putting out a climate budgeting update every year. So like Peter mentioned, that's our overall trajectory. But then in terms of new updates, we'll be doing this on an annual basis for each sort of reiteration. And then in terms of other cities using this, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier, which is related to private organizations, which is that we publish our entire methodology in a supplemental technical appendix, which is quite long, connected to our climate budgeting report. And we'll continue to do that. So any city that wants to really see the ins and outs and the nitty-gritty of how we did what we did and think about how to replicate it in that jurisdiction, will definitely be able to do so. And we are very, eagerly learning from other partners and trying to pass on what we've learned, which is why we're so excited to be part of consortia like this. So I think it's very applicable and transferable, just like the knowledge we get from other cities as well.
Thanks. Avni, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, in the Indian context, I think, I think our challenge has been how do we take, sorry, just give me a minute. Sorry, just a technical issue. No, I was saying in the Indian context, there's been a lot of interest on climate budgeting, and I think there are several cities that do want to use this as a methodology, since there has been climate action planning has been a fairly recent sort of concept in India. And I think the methodology we've developed could be replicated in other cities as well, if they wish to kind of use that methodology as well, where I mean, we've had some requests on creating an SOP and like using using the governance framework for Mumbai as like a case study and as an example to create like a format that could possibly be used in other cities. So we're definitely, I mean, I know there are other cities in India that are currently looking at climate budgeting, and Bangalore included, Bengaluru included, with, they're on the webinar right now, and they're also planning to have a workshop next, yeah, I think on Friday. So there is a lot of interest, and I think, as Mallory and Peter said, the process will have to be sort of tailored to the city's needs, their risks, their capacities, and who is anchoring this. For example, in Mumbai's case, it's the Environment and Climate Change Department that's anchoring this effort. So it looks very different from London or New York, where a very different agency is anchoring this effort. So I think I think many variables go into how a city's climate budgeting process would look like. But I think there are certain sort of key, I think Peter showed certain what is the climate budget, what it's not. I think that kind of helps you figure out, what it's not, and just work towards what it is. So yeah, I think if a city can figure out a way to do that through their municipal budgeting process, then yeah.
Thanks a lot, Avni. Yeah, I think it was great to sort of learn from the different platforms that are being set up in New York to work with private organizers, to work with agencies to carry out MEL processes, to develop guidelines such as the CRDG guidelines to really standardize design processes, which can be followed by a range of stakeholders. When you mentioned the cloudburst management plan, that really, I imagine, caters to a range of stakeholders within an area. So some sort of standardization frameworks would really have been developed in New York, and that would be really good to learn from. And I know in India, we are also focusing on medium and smaller scale ULBs to help them develop climate budgets so that you're able to channel funds from different sources to really address funding gaps as well. So I think there's a lot of potential for future cross-learning across both cities, and see how this can be standardized as a process for other cities as well who are present with us here today. In the interest of time, though, I am going to stop addressing questions from the Q&A box. I'm happy to, compile some of these questions. I think there are a couple of questions around indicators and the general methodology that's been followed for the rating of the projects through the New York climate budgeting, which I'm happy to put together and maybe send that across to you via email. And it'll be great if you can address those at your convenience. So if there are any comments from y'all, Avni, Peter, Mallory, before we close.
Sure. Happy to just say our forthcoming second publication will be released in April next year. That'll have additional insight in our methodology for our indicators and so forth. And especially speaking to resiliency guidelines, CRDG, I think what's been also very interesting, the experience while standardization for certain types of projects has been found to be key. It's also standardization across agencies that may have developed parallel guidelines as well, and making sure that is also uniform in place. That we're learning from how other agencies might evaluate certain projects differently, and that actually has been very insightful. But thank you. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, I'll just add on to Peter's thanks and just let everybody know that we're, happy to answer questions, and a lot of the details can be found online in our climate budgeting report, which is released and public. And so I would encourage everybody who's interested to take a look and give it some thought. And thank you so much for allowing us to participate and learn and share today.
Likewise, thanks everybody. Thank you for listening, and we're also currently working on our upcoming budget. We're thinking of expanding the scope of the budget, looking at newer departments and agencies. It's been an exciting journey, and yeah, we're looking to build out our adaptation and resilience piece. So yes, would be happy to answer any questions and share our learnings with cities in India and yes, across.
Yes. Aarti, I see your hand is raised.
Sorry, that was just accidental, but thank you so much to our speakers. Thanks so much for today. It was really fascinating, the conversation. So yeah, look forward. Maybe we can do like a sequel of this a year down the line.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks a lot and have a great rest of the day. Thank you for accommodating this at the hour that you had to begun, Peter and Mallory. And thanks again, Avni. For our participants, our next masterclass would be focused on branding and communications, actually. So do look out for some news on that as well. And thanks everyone for joining in. Bye. Have a nice
Bye.
day.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye.